School graciously allowed you guys to put off your exam by a couple of days. All right?
Yeah.
Congratulations. He is the Belinsky Professor? Balkansky Professor of Applied Physics?
Physics and Applied Physics.
Physics and Applied Physics. I'm getting it wrong. At Harvard University. So, kind of a big deal, I would say. But he's one of the few faculty members that I can say pioneered this type of learning. And he's still very, very research active. So, both hats simultaneously. Somewhat rare in higher academia to try to connect with students on both the lower level and the highest level. So I am very grateful to be able to sit and be a student again in the classroom. Feel free to, as he goes, ask questions. It's a physics talk, I guess.
No.
But it's about learning, and more learning than anything else, and how we're trying to make use of this space.
Thank you. That was very nice. I didn't know I was interfering with your exam. He didn't tell me that beforehand. Actually, this afternoon I'll be talking about exams and assessments. So if you're interested in... Oh, is it going in and out?
It is.
And I really, since I'm giving 4 talks today, I want to use the microphone to save my voice. Put it up a little bit. Okay. Anyway, so if you want to hear more about my views of exams, shall I just ditch the microphone?
Yes.
I think I'll ditch the microphone. The problem is it's hard to project on both sides. So if you want to know more about my views on examinations and studying and assessment, I'll be talking about that at what time? 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock. And I think I would love for some of you to be there because I would love to hear your views on assessment. I only started to think about that recently. The title of the talk, by the way, is Assessment, the Silent Killer of Learning. I meant to be provocative there. Anyway, a few years ago, I took a year off to completely rethink my approach to teaching. I've already, going back 25 years, I started to change my approach to teaching. So if you've ever been in an interactive lecture where clickers have been used, if you like it, you can attribute it to me. If you don't like it, it was badly implemented, let's say. Anyway, so I took a year off to basically rethink my approach to teaching from the ground up. And during that year, I visited a number of universities to see what innovative approaches to teaching have been developed around the world. And I also read a lot of books about teaching. And one book had a particularly big impact. This book here was the title, Who Owns the Learning? Written by a friend of mine, Alan November, who is actually an educational consultant for K-12 education. I don't usually like reading education books. They're not the most exciting books to read. But I told him that I would write a little blurb for the back cover. So I got a manuscript from the publisher before the publication. And I carried it in my briefcase for many, many months, trying to put off reading it until I was on a flight where all of my devices had run out of batteries. I'd read the in-flight magazine, any newspaper I could get my hands on. I had no choice. That was the only other thing left to do during this long trans-Pacific flight. I opened the manuscript, and in the foreword, the first sentence grabbed me. It said, "Have you ever experienced something that made you completely reconsider the essence of something you thought was true?" I was hooked. He recalls in that foreword something that happened to him in the early 80s when he was a high school teacher at Lexington High School, which is an affluent suburb west of Boston. Lexington High School was one of the first schools to have a computer classroom. Remember, 1980s, that's when PCs sort of came on the market. So computer classroom was something really new. And he was in charge of that computer classroom. On a Sunday morning, he gets a phone call from the Lexington Police Department there had been a break-in in the computer classroom. Would he please come to the school? He gets dressed, drives the 40 minutes from his home in Marblehead to Lexington, arrives at the school, parks his car, and notices that none of the windows of the computer classroom are broken. He goes inside the school, goes to the computer classroom. The door has not been forced open. He opens the door, looks inside. All of the computers are still there. There's just one strange thing. There's a student sitting at one of the computers. So he goes over to the student and says, "Gary, what are you doing here?" And Gary looks up at him and says, "I want to learn how to program the computer." And that's when he realized that if somebody wants to learn, they'll do anything. They'll break the law. You can't stop them. Right? And look at small children, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe till 9 years old or something like that. They're, sponges for knowledge. They don't learn because we make them suffer or we make them do things they don't want to do. They learn because they want to learn. We're all born with this innate curiosity, this desire to learn. So why is it that education does such a phenomenal job turning that innate drive to learn off? That really made me think. I thought, how can I create an environment where students learn not because I tell them to learn, they learn because they want to learn. Now, that's one thing with computer programming, right? We know that computers can be addictive. What about my subject, physics, which, most students already hate before they even set foot into my classroom? So the idea I came up with was to create a Trojan horse. And the Trojan horse would basically hide the physics. The Trojan horse that I dreamed up was a combination of two things. One, team-based learning, and the other, project-based learning. Get the students to work on projects that are really exciting, that are fun, but that require them to learn the physics. So in other words, they learn the physics because it's the only way to do the project, but the project itself is fun, which is the way we learn all the things around us, right? I mean, think back of the time that you were in elementary school and kindergarten. I mean, learning was not the type of feeling, it did not evoke the type of feelings that cramming for an exam, for example, now will evoke. And the team-based approach has two other huge benefits. One is you develop a social responsibility for learning. If you don't stay on top of your material, you're letting your team down. You're not letting Professor Mazur down. No, you're letting your team down. So rather than me being the bad guy, there's sort of this social pressure to stay on top of the material. You're doing it together, not alone with a responsibility towards the teacher. So if you look into my class now, you see something that's actually pretty similar to what you see here, except that we don't have all the technology you have here. We do not have screens around the wall. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the design of the course, and then I'll talk about the approach, and lastly, I'll talk about the results. And this is I'm giving you a shortened version of a longer talk, and I didn't get a chance to sort out my slides last night, so I'll have to skip a few parts. Now, we started in physics, and I'm sure it's no different here. How many of you have taken a physics course? Okay, most of you, or taking one, probably. And at Harvard, just as at just about any other universities, we had 4 tracks, which were all modeled after the track that was aimed at the majors. So the course for physics majors was watered down a little bit for the engineering majors, was watered down a little bit more for the life science majors, which was watered down a little bit more for everybody else. But the basic idea behind all of those courses was the course for majors. And of course, the course for majors works no matter what you do, because most physics majors have already developed that ownership of learning. They're taking that course because they want to become successful in physics. But to assume that that will work for chemistry, engineering majors, life science majors is, of course, a fallacy. So it was clear to me that this approach did not satisfy the needs of the non-majors. And anything that we do to benefit the non-majors will also benefit the majors, because why not help them too? So it became clear for me that I first had to align the goals to what the students' needs were, rather than thinking, let's just take this physics majors course that has not evolved in the past 100 years and basically water it down. The second thing was to change the approach to teaching to a project-based approach, and the last one was to change the learning space, get away from amphitheater, which, that type of space was never designed as a learning space. Who designed the amphitheater? The ancient Greek, right? Why did they develop that space? What was the reason? Theater, music, performances, right? So that everybody could hear and everybody could see the performers. Did the Greek ever teach in amphitheaters? Never. If you look at an illustration of the School of Athens, you see people walking around in pairs, talking, discussing, exchanging ideas. It's not just, a spectator sport. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, in Europe, we adopted the performance space as a learning space. And I think that's where a lot of things went wrong. Of course, lots of professors like to perform, so that's why maybe the method survived for that long time. So I started by setting goals, right? And the standard approach to teaching, rather than thinking about the desired outcome, you think about the content. In this course, we're going to cover topic A, topic B, topic C, topic D. And then the professor starts covering topic A, topic B, topic C, topic D. And then after a while, start thinking, how am I going to assess that students have actually learned something? So the exam is an afterthought. A much better approach would be to use backward design. Let's ask ourselves, what do we want the students to be able to do after taking this course? Maybe not even immediately after, but 5 years after taking the course. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, to think about the output rather than the input. In fact, I find that most of my colleagues, they all nod yes, but then when it comes down to actually writing desired outcomes, it's very hard for them. They'll think about it for a while, and then they think, after taking this course, you will be able to understand topic A, topic B, topic C, topic D. And then, of course, you're back at square zero. I'll talk a little bit more about this in my talk this afternoon. So then I asked myself, what am I going to accept as evidence that I've actually accomplished these outcomes? And lastly, what instructional approach can I put in place to maximize these outcomes? So I did a long survey of my colleagues, and I came up with 3 lists, which I'm not going to show you, but if any of you is interested in seeing them, I'm happy to share them. One was a set of competencies like design, teamwork, communication, ethics, things that are so important in your later career, and they're actually never directly addressed by any of the courses you take. But they're so important, they should be embedded in each and every course you take. In addition to these competencies, which are at the highest level, is a list of course goals, at a slightly longer list. And then there's a much more detailed list of content-specific goals. Be able to apply Newton's laws to do this or that. Be able to, apply kinematics to solve problems of this or that kind. Again, I'm not going to bother you with the details because this is not a talk about physics. It's really, as you heard, about learning. The next thing was to get rid of this amphitheater, because look at this picture. You can see right away that a space like that is focused on information transfer. The professor in front of the class delivering information to the audience. It's centered on the faculty, not on the students. In any room such as this, you are the important person, not the professor. You are the learner. We're there to help you learn. So it should not be centered on us. It should be centered on you. So we built a new classroom, very much like this one. This is a picture. It was an old library that was converted, which has windows on 3 sides. You see 2 sides. You see the one side that doesn't have window and one of the sides that have windows. And that created a problem because we couldn't put whiteboards and screens on the walls like you have. So all we have are mobile boards, very much like this one. And we often move them between the tables so as to form cubicles so that each team gets its own little cubicle. So even if you wanted to lecture there as a professor, you can't, because half of the students, or even more, cannot see you. You're hidden behind the board, as you can see on the picture there. There's just no way you can lecture in that space. It would be difficult for me even to give a talk like this in that space with these whiteboards. Of course, you could move them all to the sides, but then you're covering the whiteboards. No technology, you see no screens. Well, there is a screen if I absolutely need to project something, but the idea is we don't want people to look away from their teams. It also makes a large class smaller. Capacity in that room right now is 70, but we have a number of these classes and we can link them. Right, I can start a class in one of the space. Since it's mostly student-centered activities, students don't even notice whether I'm there or not. So I can start in one and then, have my voice via a speaker in the other one and then walk to the other classroom. So we can sort of scale it in units of 70 or maybe even 100. We were limited basically to an occupancy of 84 because of the fire code. But I think in terms of surface area, we could probably put more people. You look at this picture and it's focused on interaction. Right? Now you're on a mobile chair, so you can turn around and you're all facing me, but that would be really unusual. And I'm sure that if I were to come here on a random day, you're facing each other and looking at each other rather than looking at the instructor. Let's talk about the approach. In terms of the approach, I decided to use the flipped classroom model, which I pioneered 24 years ago, although a modified version of that. What is the flipped classroom model? Well, in the standard approach, you get the first exposure to the material in the class. And then you go home, and while doing homework and poring over your notes, you try to develop a deeper understanding of the material that was introduced in class. Think about that for a moment. Now that we live in the information age, isn't that almost insulting? Right? If you ask, what is the hardest part between these 2 steps? Is the first exposure the hard part? Or is the developing a deeper understanding the hard part? I think we'd all agree it's that second step, not the first step. So our professors, that includes me by the way, should really be focusing on that second step, not on the first step. You can read, you can watch something online. Why watch it in the classroom? It's a waste of your time. It would be much better if you did that first exposure before coming to class, so that in class, the professors can be there to help you develop a better understanding. So I decided there would be no lectures at all, none, 0. Me talking like this to you, I'm very happy that I'm getting the opportunity to talk to you because I don't get to do that in my own institution anymore. So, and I love lecturing, so thank you. The other thing is I decided no exams. I think it was Einstein who once said, education is what is left after all that is learned is forgotten. Just think about it, right? You cram for an exam, you pass the exam, a week later you forget. Why even study, right? Is that the right way to actually learn? I think we'd all agree. And you learn a lot of very important skills like tying your shoelaces, putting your fork in your mouth, you name it, without lectures, without exams. Shouldn't that be the way we learn everything? Rather than studying for the exam, why don't we study to learn? In an ideal world, those 2 things are the same. But as you well know, and I think most people who teach also know, people end up cramming to pass the exam, cramming to get the grade. More about that in my talk at 1 o'clock. And then not really learning any valuable skills. So there are three major components to this course. One is the information transfer, which takes place out of class. How do we do that information transfer? Secondly, there are the in-class activities, and thirdly, the projects. I'm going to talk about those three now. Let's start with the information transfer. One way would be to film me giving a standard lecture and then have people watch those lectures online. But the problem, I wish I had more time to talk about that, but I don't, and there's ample evidence showing that right now, that when you listen to somebody speak, there's not an opportunity for you to actually think. See, our brains are not wired to multitask. We either listen or we think. Have you ever had somebody in one of the classes you've taken here or anywhere else raise his or her hand and say, "Professor, could you please be quiet for 10 minutes? I need to think." It's never happened in my teaching career. But you know, you either listen or you think, right? Because if you think, I don't understand this, your mind wanders and you're no longer, by the time your mind comes back to listening, you've lost part of the information. Right? So when you listen to somebody, online you could of course hit the pause button, but very few people do that actually. They want to get through this lecture as quickly as possible. With reading, you regulate the flow of information, right? If you're reading a book and you think, I don't understand something, you stop reading and then you can start again when your mind is ready to take in new information. So you can regulate this flow. So that's why I decided not to use video, but to use a social document annotation system. So my students get the book in electronic format, and if they have a question about something, they can drag a rectangle, highlight the text, and type in a question. So for example, here, for that highlighted piece of text, one student says, "Yes, this is where I'm confused from the first paragraph, blah, 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 blah." Then a day later, another student 2 says, maybe they're trying to say that there is blah, 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 and so on, in response to this other student. And then student 3 pitches in, "I agree that the motion is not obvious," and so forth. Student 2 comes back in, "Oh, the answers to this question kind of address my question above." The students are having this asynchronous discussion, helping each other understand the text electronically. So even though they're in separate rooms and at separate instances in time, they help each other understand the more difficult parts in the text. In 2 semesters, we got 30,000 annotations from a class of 70 students, 30,000 annotations, which provide an incredible amount of information, more than any human being could, of course, parse. I look at them and I can see the hot spots. I can see a graphical representation of where the students struggle the most in the text, so that I can design what happens in classroom to focus on the parts that the students have difficulty with. So what about in class? Well, in class we use a blend of best practices that I discovered while going around the world. I decided also that we would not meet 2 times an hour and a half or 3 times 1 hour in class and then have another discussion section and another laboratory. No, we'd fold it all together and meet twice a week for 3 hours. Right, in normal classes, I don't know about your science classes, but you have lecture, and then you have a discussion section, and then you have a lab, and each time you go home, you do something else, and you come back. And often these components in your mind and in reality are not really well integrated. There's the lab, which is a different thing from the lecture. Maybe there's some connections here and there, but they're usually tenuous. And there's the discussion section, which might focus on problem solving. Why have that? Why not have 2 big blocks? You get into the physics mode for 3 hours, and we do lots of activities during those 2 3-hour periods. So the different activities are listed here, like estimation, reflection, and so on, and I will discuss them in a moment in a little bit more detail. The activities, and they're on the screen there and color-coded, basically go from developing conceptual understanding to mastery. and to self-assessment of how much you know as a student. So here you see the schedule color-coded. So this is class meeting 1, and here's class meeting 2, class meeting 3. And this whole block is 3 hours. So 1.5 hours is spent on this dark blue one, which is learning catalytics, and then another hour and a half on a tutorial, and so on. I basically put these blocks of activities in there to fill the 3 hours. And there are 3 months in the term. This is the first month here, which ends with a project fair where the students display their projects. And then the next period is another month, and then another month. There are 3 in each semester for a total of 6 projects in the entire year. 2/3 of the time is spent on these activities. They're scaffolded, right? So that you learn a little bit, and then you learn more. And they reinforce one another. It's not just going from 0 to 100% in one step, because that's not how you learn. You keep revisiting things in different contexts. And then 1/3 of the time is left unguided. In fact, not on this, well, on class 17, you see it's completely white. This is time for the students to work on their projects. It might be in the room, it might be in a machine shop when they're building things. It might be outside, whichever they want. They can come to the classroom so that they can talk to us about problems with their project. And then, of course, is the big project day, the fair, which is usually a public event. We hold that in a space where many other students can see it. This is publicity for the course, right? They see, oh, all these interesting projects. What class is that? I'm going to take that class next year. Okay, so let's now talk briefly about the different activities. One is learning catalytics, which some of you may have encountered in some of your classes, I don't know. Basically, the goal is to develop conceptual understanding, and to do that by questioning, right? I started developing peer instruction 24 years ago, and shortly afterwards the clicker was invented to support that method of interactive teaching. Ask a question, have students talk to each other, I re-answer the question. But the problem is that is the multiple choice aspect. I never liked that. So I developed learning catalytics, which some of you may have used in some courses because I know it's used on campus here, to avoid multiple choice questions. So here's a question that deals with a light ray, this thin line here, that hits 2 mirrors that are at right angle. And the question is, after bouncing off the 2 mirrors, in which direction does the light travel? I had this in my book that I wrote in 1997 about peer instruction, but the only way I could ask it then was a multiple choice question. So I put the correct answer straight back, because that's the only question I as a physicist could come up with. But then what do you put as plausible wrong choices? There my mind doesn't really help very much, because I suffer from what my colleague Steven Pinker calls the curse of knowledge. I can think about it the right way, but I don't know what a plausible wrong way is that a student would think about it. So I just put some random things in my book. But in learning catalytics, I can just have the students draw the direction. So on their smartphones or tablets or laptops, they draw an arrow. And on my screen, which is in the background, I can see all of the arrows that the class draws. And as you can see, a very large proportion thinks they're going below the horizontal. I'm not here to teach you physics, but you can very easily show with the law of reflection and some trigonometry that it has to go straight back as indicated by those green arrows. Then I tell my students, now work at it with your team. The teams are 5 students. We have 6 chairs, exactly like you have, but we leave 1 empty for the staff so that I can go to a table and I can actually sit down so that I'm not talking down to the student and become part of the team. I think that's very important. So we have, like you, tables that have 6 chairs, but 1 is always empty. That's for whoever is there from the staff, so that we don't come and talk down to the students, because then the students look up and they take the instructor as the authority. I want to be one of them. Okay, so they talk to each other. They go to the board, they make some drawings, and then they re-answer, and you can see that after talking to each other, far fewer students choose the incorrect answer, not multiple choice. So this is probably the most traditional part of this class, which I do in these dark blue colored areas. Then other time is spent on tutorials. The idea there is to address documented misconceptions that have been found in research in physics education. So the students work on these worksheets, and these worksheets are meant to work on an elicit, confront, resolve cycle. You elicit the misconception, you allow the students to make that mistake, that the misconception that many students have. Then you confront them through a series of questions with the inconsistency in that thinking, and then help resolve it. Right? So rather than ignoring the misconception, you actually elicit it and then help resolve it. So during that time, the students are working on this worksheet with their team, and we basically walk from table to table, guiding them along. Another one is an estimation activity. I don't know how many courses here do this, but I know that at my institution, very few courses actually train students in estimating quantities. It's so important, right, that you can get a feel for things before diving into the equations. The equations are handy later on, but it's so useful if you could just, get a feel for quantities involved. What is the total amount of energy stored in a 9-volt battery? How much energy do you as a human being, or power, are you capable of generating as a human being? You could Google that, but wouldn't it be great if you could think about this and come up with an order of magnitude and have confidence in that? Wouldn't that make you such a better person? Wouldn't it make you feel just good about your own abilities and your own reasoning skills? Well, the only way to be able to do that is to try it out and to actually train you in doing that. So we have an estimation activity where basically the goal is to help develop these qualitative reasoning skills rather than quantitative reasoning skills. So we give each team a piece of paper that has 5 or 6 questions, like, for example, estimate the amount of charge generated by connecting an AA battery to a large capacitor. Now, most students, even at Harvard University, would panic when they see a question like that. What is a large capacitor? You're not giving me a value. Well, let's estimate what kind of capacitors we can make and take it from there. And we don't give any credit for this. There's a lot of the things have no credit at all, but we turn it into a team competition. The first team that gets the 5 or 6 orders of magnitude right wins. They don't win anything, but they win. You have no idea what that does, okay? There's where the team spirit comes. So the students jump into this. And of course you could Google a lot of these values. That's fine, but you're cheating yourself. So, and since there's no credit or nothing winning, we tell people, try not to Google things, but to actually use your brain, because the big reward here is not points you get. The big reward is that you learn how to use that precious gray matter in your skull. It's so liberating, it's so exciting. So this actually always creates an incredible amount of buzz in the classroom. We do that. They have half an hour to estimate the 5 or 6 quantities. Then we have an experimental design activity. Since we have no lab, we have to train them in certain experimental skills. For example, one of the projects is building a Rube Goldberg machine. And then the students have to measure all the momentum and energy transformations that happen in the 6 steps of this Rube Goldberg machine that they design. Now, you could go to a lab, physics lab, and you'll see carts going on low friction tracks, something that you will encounter daily in your life later on. That was meant sarcastically, by the way. Right? I mean, you see these low friction carts with force sensors and so on, but the real world is much more messy. I'm sorry, but there is friction in the real world, and it's much more complicated, and there are no force sensors in Rube Goldberg machines. So they have to learn the skills to take measurements on something that is in the real world. So we use their laptops or smartphones to take videos, and then they learn how to do video tracking, get the data out of the video. So we have, for example, several experimental activities, design activities that are focused on teaching those skills of video tracking. So they might get a graph of a motion, then they have to use stop animation software to make a movie of it, then they have to import the movie in video tracking and try to get the original graph back out. This teaches visual representations of motion and also this skill of analyzing motion and getting data out of it. Or for another project, they have to build the musical instruments from recycled parts. And they have to determine things like the Q factor, the harmonic spectrum, the tuning stability of their instrument, and so on. Now, how do you do that? With tuning forks, that's all nice and dandy, but with an instrument that you make from recycled parts, it's not that obvious, right? So we teach them how to use Audacity, which is a piece of software that does analysis of sound waves. So in the classroom, they may do this with a tuning fork and some very simple, nice instruments, but they learn the skills that they will need to then later apply to their much more messy real-world instrument. Then the homework is there, but the homework is very different from standard approaches to doing homework. One is we want students to develop problem-solving skills, but also to develop something else which is really important for all of you. And you know, I know that you're freshmen, you're at the beginning of your career here, so this is the right time to think about it. It's something that psychologists call metacognitive skills. Metacognitive skills is the ability to assess your own learning, to evaluate your own learning, right? Rather than waiting until somebody else assesses it and give you a grade, which might not be the best measure of your actual learning. Why is that so important? That's so important because when you get your diploma in 3.5 years here, when these professors that are here in this room hand you your diploma, that is not when learning stops. You might go on to graduate school and then get another diploma, but even then, when you get that diploma, that is not when learning stops. That's when learning really starts. Trust me, living is learning. As soon as you stop learning, there's no living anymore. You continue learning. And then you're on your own. Your professors will no longer be there to hold your hands, tell you what to do. You need to assess your own. You need to evaluate your own learning. You need to know what to do. So learning how to evaluate your own learning is probably the most important skill you can get out of college. Most important skill. Unfortunately, there's very little opportunity for students in a traditional environment to develop that skill, because the assessment is always done by faculty members. So we give problem sets that are very similar to standard problem sets, except the approach is very different. There are two phases. One is solving the problems at home, individual. We tell the students, do not work together, which is the opposite of what most faculty members say. They'll say, here's homework, go and work at it together. We tell them, work at it alone. Treat it like a take-home exam, except that we will not evaluate the answer. We evaluate the effort you put into it. Well, there's only one way to convince somebody who looks at your homework that you put in effort. That is to put in the effort. And by putting in the effort, you learn without having this pressure, I got to get the right answer, otherwise I lose a point. Students can only write in a blue or black ink. In class, we give them a red pen, and they're only allowed to use that red pen. And there, they have to mark up their work with that red pen. That's the metacognitive step. So students come to class and say, oh, in this problem I got 5.2 volts. What did you get, John? And, oh, you have 2.6. How did you get 2.6? And they'll go to the board and they'll work it out. And they basically get to correct their own work, first just by talking to each other, and later we put the official solution on the table, and they have that as a backup. And again, it's not a matter of getting the right answer, it's a matter of getting the right skills and to evaluate your work correctly. So at the end they write a little reflection. This is what I learned, this is what I need to review. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through the rubric. I'm going to skip the rubric because I want to be able to finish this on time. Here's, for example, some students came, I'd never seen this in my career, it was 25 pages. They were desperate to show me that they'd put in the effort. 25 pages. Normally it's 2 pages with just the answer. And some students said that, they had a habit for most of their science classes to wait until the problem set was due, then go to the boxes where you hand in the problem set half hour early to just verify that they had had the right answer with other students who were also handing in their work. And they had to fight that habit. They were working on the problem set and saying, I got to get the right. Oh, no, it doesn't matter what the right answer is. You just have to put in the effort. Because if you put in the effort, you'll learn. Whereas getting the right answer might not be really an indication that you have learned. Here's one student who said, I was inspired and encouraged to do these problems on my own with the promise of collaborative work the next day. Another student who said, I felt less pressure to find the right answer and more freedom to explore. I'll talk about creativity and innovation in my talk at 1. This student actually shows that, willing to explore, take risk. Right? If you want to be innovative, creative, if you want to break new ground, you have to be okay with failing. The road to innovation is littered with failures. Our current approaches to assessment don't promote that. You get afraid of making a mistake because making a mistake makes you lose a point. Well, here, it's no problem. The answer is, at least at this stage in the learning, not important yet. Then we have readiness assurance activity. I'm going to skip this because I'm going to discuss that in my talk at 1. It's a substitute for the exam. So instead of exams, I have formative assessment. There's a form of collaborative learning. I don't think you've ever thought of an exam as an opportunity to learn, right? But this actually, you have actually students go high five and laugh and go, yes! And, during the exam. I'll show movies in my 1 o'clock talk. I'm going to instead skip and go straight to the projects. How do you design good projects? Because remember, the project is a Trojan horse, right? You want to design it so that it gets the students to learn the physics that you want them to learn, or at least develop the skills, I should say, that you want them to master. So I went to the Harvard Business School, which teaches using the case study method. And the Harvard Business School does a fantastic job designing cases. They're used in business schools all over the world. And they have a set of very simple design rules. But before I get to that, I want to quickly say a few things. So we have 3 projects per semester. Each is roughly 1 month long. And we design a different team for each project. So you might be working with a certain group which we form. You don't get to select your team. We tell students who they're on the team. And we use a series of psychological profiles and other metrics to form those teams. After all, later, when you take your first job, you do not choose who you work with. You have to work with whoever you work with. And learning how to work with people who might have different opinions is a crucial skill, because if you don't work well together, you're not going to be doing well in your job. So learning those collaborative skills is truly important. So after you've done the first project, we jumble up the teams. You may have developed a fantastic team. Sorry, you're going to work with other people. So you work with very different people in the second, and so on. The projects are not prescriptive, but open-ended. Each team will come up with a completely different solution. So there are as many solutions as there are teams. Think about how that compares to normal homework problems you do. There's only one solution. There might be 100 people doing the same problem. There's only one correct solution. Well, in the real world, it doesn't work that way. The reason we all have different cell phones and different cars and so on is because there are many solutions to the same problem. And creativity should allow for that multitude of solutions. So therefore, having something that's open-ended is really important. And then we have 3 different types of project fairs. It could be a design competition or an oral presentation or a poster presentation to also get the communication skills. Now, here's what I learned from the business school, that good cases must have three important properties. And I just replaced the word case by project. One, it has to require the practical application of skills, right? So for example, if it's a finance class, you want your students to be able to determine the market capitalization of different companies, or to determine the stock price in an initial public offering, right? Because those are skills that these people who are going to go into finance must master. Well, in physics, you have similar type of skills. You want students to be able to, determine things like motion or energy and so on, because those might be important as engineers later on. It must be linked to real-world problem. The way the business school does is very simple. They go to the Wall Street Journal, they look at cases with companies, and then they change the names of the companies so that students cannot just Google what the initial public offering price is. In physics, it's a little bit harder, right? Because most physics textbooks they pretend to deal with the real world, but then, everything is frictionless and there's no gravitation and you can ignore this and that. I'm sorry, in the real world, it doesn't work that way. But it's not that hard to do because look around us. Everything is physics, in a sense. So just inspire yourself from the world around you. And the last thing was really sort of surprising to me. I'd never thought about it. And every case, and therefore every project, must have a component of empathy or social good. It must put you, the student, in a role where you help people or improve the world. Because that turns out to be one of the most compelling ways in which you can take ownership. That was really hard for me in the beginning. How do you do that in physics? But it was not that hard, I don't know, how many of you are familiar with El Sistema in Venezuela, which is it's a system. It's one of the few things that is okay in Venezuela. The rest is pretty screwed up. But El Sistema is pretty remarkable. It was an idea of a lawyer in 1969 to fight poverty by putting kids in slums in classical orchestra, in the environment of a classical orchestra. Right now, there are 400,000 kids in Venezuela where after school, instead of playing in the slums, they're going to make music in a classical orchestra. And some really famous musicians have come out of that system. Dudamel, who is the conductor for Los Angeles Philharmonic, for example, and many, many more, both in classical music and popular music. So if you look at some documentaries that have been made, you see students after school go to this. It's beautiful. Just Google El Sistema. Not now, after my talk, and you'll see some beautiful examples. But you also see that in the earlier grades, there's no money to buy instruments. So the students play on cardboard instruments. They'll play the violin, and the teacher just turns up a boombox that makes music. So they learn at least to move the bow in the right rhythm, but there's no music. So the goal for my students is to design instruments that can be cheaply made for less than $15 from recycled parts that make beautiful sound. And there's a way to improve the world. Some of you may have seen the recycled trash orchestra in Paraguay. It was a YouTube video that went viral, I think, 2 years ago. So think along those lines. I show that to my students. They all want to make an instrument. They all want to find a way to get it to third world countries to help there. Anyway, so one project, for example, is a mission to Mars. They get a project brief, which then they have to work on. This is and I'm sorry, the sound is not connected. It doesn't really matter because you can see it. They have to design a Rube Goldberg machine. I'm sorry, I filmed this with my phone, so it's kind of jerky. A Rube Goldberg machine that has at least 6 steps. One has an elastic collision, another has an inelastic collision, and then the last step has to crack open an egg. And they have to determine all the energy transfers and how much energy goes into the Rube Goldberg machine and how much energy. How do I turn the media mute? That's okay. I don't know how to get the. Okay, the egg was cracked open, as you can see. So they have to calculate all of the energies and that requires a lot of physics knowledge. Another very popular project is the Crackathon, which was inspired by the Weizmann Institute. They have to design a safe that uses principles from electromagnetism. It has 5 opaque and 1 transparent side. And then during the competition, each team goes to a neighboring team's safe and has 8 minutes to try to reverse engineer the mechanism, which uses electromagnetism, to reverse engineer that and crack open the safe. And here you see some students who are busy trying to understand how this safe works, right? I mean, you first have to see how it works. You have 8 minutes and there's incredible time pressure. They weren't even aware of me holding my phone more or less in their face, filming it, because they were so concentrated on figuring out how it worked. They actually did not manage to crack it open. But that's okay, because that doesn't go into the grade. Here's another team busy with that same safe, and as you can see, they eventually managed to crack it open. Now, one thing that unfortunately I don't have time to discuss, because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, is that it's very important in teams that everybody contributes. Right? I mean, you don't want a team where there's one student who sloughs off, and then the other team members do all the work. So you have to create a mechanism so that everybody feels compelled to contribute to the team. So we have a self-peer and team assessment that puts students in a prisoner's dilemma. The only way, you have to evaluate yourself and others, but there's a mechanism built in, I can't go into the details right now, that is so that the only thing you can do is be honest. There's no way of playing the system, because if you're dishonest, the other people will reveal that, and you actually lose more than you would have lost by being just honest if you've not done your work. And we do that continuously, that peer assessment, so students quickly get feedback from their team members, not from me, from their team members on how they're doing. Okay, I'm going to skip through the assessment, but I want to talk briefly about the results in these last 5 minutes. What about ownership? The course evaluation was 4.2 out of 5. With not a single student who takes this course as an elective, okay? It's a requirement for all of these students. If they had a choice, they would probably not take a course. That's remarkably high. The structure of the class, in one comment, wrote one student, made what was my least favorite subject into one of my favorites. I was worried that people, including myself, would just slack off and do the bare minimum. But you really need to be on top of your readings and concepts in order to contribute to your team. Great class. Here's another student. Dear Harvard students, this class will be unlike any class you've taken, and it will hopefully shift the entire foundation upon which you've based your education. I truly believe everyone should take this course. And this student actually mentioned ownership. I'd never spoken about ownership. Prepare to take full ownership of your learning. The attendance was above the theoretical maximum. Right? I mean, normally when I teach a normal class, 60% of the students are there and 40 don't show up, even if I bribe them. Here, I don't bribe them to come to class. Attendance is not taken. 94% attendance, and the other one, 97. That's above the theoretical maximum because there are always people who are sick. In fact, sometimes students came to class even though they were sick. I got emails saying, you know, I don't feel very well today and I don't think I can contribute, but I don't want to let my team down. They're not coming to class for me, and they shouldn't come to class for me. They come to class for the team. And the other thing is, it's a 3-hour class that's long, and they don't leave. You know, the hour goes by. Since I don't speak, they're busy working on something. You don't even notice that 1 o'clock, the clock has struck 1 o'clock, you know, and maybe a few leave, but most of them are there. After 10 minutes, I got to tell them, hey, you know, another class is going to come here soon. You got to leave. 20 minutes later, I have to shove them out of the classroom because they're having so much fun on their project and on the other activities. We also measure how much they learn and compare to 2 other classes that have similar content, Physical Sciences 2 and Physics 11A, and measure the normalized gain, which is a measure of how much the students learn. Neither of those two classes were taught by me, and by absolute standards comparing to other classes nationwide and even worldwide, that's a pretty good gain for a traditional class. In AP 50, no lectures at all. Students had a significantly larger gain. Likewise on electricity and magnetism, this is when I do my absolute best lecturing. I get this gain. In AP 50, no lectures at all. They have the same gain. So the learning does take place. I want to end with the picture I started with. Look at these students. They are not laughing because they're posing for the photographer. They're laughing because they've actually taken ownership of their learning, and they're actually having fun. They're actually having fun during that competition, and it's the same even in other activities in the class. In fact, the word fun appeared over and over in the evaluations. You come out with so much knowledge and experience and fun. And I think that the best learning takes place when you experience it as fun. Learning does not have to be suffering. It should be fun. Just look in a kindergarten, right? In fact, if you step into my classroom at a random time, you may actually think I'm teaching kindergarten. And I think that is the way it should be. Thank you for your...